The briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana fell silent except for the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. 23 Navy SEALs sat in rigid formation, their eyes fixed on the flight log spread across the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. The pages were worn, coffee-stained, and filled with coordinates that shouldn't exist in any official record. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Razor Kellerman held the log with trembling fingers, his weathered face pale beneath the harsh lighting. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. The woman standing at the front of the room didn't flinch. Captain Indira Ghost Nakamura had weathered worse storms than a room full of skeptical special operators. Her slight frame barely cast a shadow against the projection screen behind her, but her presence filled every corner of the space. The silver wings pinned to her flight suit caught the light as she breathed, each exhale measured and deliberate. "That's my flight log, Commander," she said, her voice steady as a metronome. "Every coordinate, every timestamp, every fuel calculation mine." 3 weeks earlier, those same SEALs had laughed when they first saw her name on the mission roster. Ghost Nakamura, they'd called her mockingly, the pilot who got her call sign not for being elusive in combat, but for being invisible in the squadron-ready room. She was 34 years old, 5'4", and had accumulated more flight hours than most of them had tactical jumps. But she was also the daughter of a rice farmer from Fresno, a woman in a man's profession, and someone who preferred silence to swagger. The laughter had died when they cross-referenced her log entries with Operation Neptune's Shadow, a mission so classified that its existence was known only to 12 people in the entire Department of Defense. The coordinates in Ghost's personal flight log matched, down to the second, the extraction points used in a deep-cover infiltration of a terrorist compound in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The dates aligned perfectly, with intelligence-gathering operations that had never been officially acknowledged by any government agency. Commander Kellerman set the log down with the reverence reserved for holy relics. His team had spent 72 hours trying to explain the impossible, how a transport pilot flying routine supply missions had somehow documented one of the most sensitive special operations in modern military history. The implications were staggering. Either Ghost Nakamura was a security risk of unprecedented magnitude, or she was something else entirely. Outside the briefing room windows, FA-18 Super Hornets screamed across the Virginia sky, their engines carving white contrails against the gray November clouds. Ghost watched them through the glass, remembering another sky, another time, when the horizon had been painted with tracer fire, and the sound of rotors had been the only thing standing between life and death. The first time anyone called her Ghost, it wasn't meant as a compliment. Lieutenant Nakamura had been the only woman in her flight training class at Corpus Christi, moving through the program with methodical precision while her male counterparts competed for attention and glory. She didn't join the late-night drinking sessions or the boastful hangar conversations. Instead, she studied weather patterns, memorized terrain maps, and practiced emergency procedures, until her fingers moved across cockpit controls like a pianist performing a beloved symphony. Her instructor pilots noted her technical proficiency but questioned her command presence. She was too quiet, they said, too reserved. In a profession where confidence could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, Ghost's understated demeanor was seen as a liability. She graduated third in her class, high enough to prove her competence, low enough to ensure she'd be assigned to the unglamorous world of transport aviation. For 8 years, she'd flown cargo missions across 3 continents, medical supplies to field hospitals in Afghanistan, equipment drops to forward operating bases in Iraq, routine flights that kept the military machine functioning but rarely made headlines or earned medals. Her service record was flawless but unremarkable, a steady accumulation of flight hours and on-time arrivals that impressed logistics officers but bored tactical commanders. The other pilots in her squadron respected her reliability but questioned her ambition. She volunteered for the night flights that others avoided, the weather-delayed missions that tested patience and skill in equal measure. Her aircraft never broke down, her deliveries never arrived late, and her fuel calculations were so precise that ground crews joked she could land with fumes in the tank and still have enough for a go-around. But respect and recognition were different currencies in military aviation. Ghost accumulated the former while watching others cash in the latter. She flew her missions, filed her reports, and returned to an empty apartment where she studied satellite imagery and weather reports with the dedication of a scholar pursuing a doctorate in applied solitude. The breakthrough came during a routine supply run to Bagram Airfield. Ghost was piloting a C-130 Hercules loaded with ammunition and medical supplies when air traffic control diverted her to an alternate landing zone. The coordinates led to a remote strip of hard-packed desert that didn't appear on any official chart. She found herself landing in complete radio silence, guided only by infrared strobes visible through night vision goggles. As her cargo was unloaded by figures in black tactical gear, Ghost noticed something that would change everything. The men moving through the darkness weren't regular Army or Marines. Their equipment was different, their movements too coordinated, their silence too disciplined. These were special operations personnel conducting a mission that officially didn't exist. The cargo manifest she'd been given listed medical supplies and ammunition, but the crates being unloaded were marked with symbols she didn't recognize. More importantly, the coordinates of this unnamed landing strip were burned into her memory with photographic precision. That night, in the privacy of her quarters, she made her first entry in what would become the most controversial flight log in military history. The entries accumulated over months: unscheduled course deviations, fuel consumption rates that didn't match reported distances, landing coordinates that placed her aircraft in locations where, according to official records, she'd never been. Ghost wasn't trying to expose classified operations. She was simply maintaining the detailed flight records that had become her professional signature. But inadvertently, she was documenting the shadow war being fought beyond the reach of congressional oversight or public scrutiny. Each entry was precise: date, time, coordinates, fuel consumption, weather conditions. The accumulated data painted a picture of special operations flights that paralleled her official missions like a ghost formation flying just outside radar detection. Ghost had become an unwitting historian of America's most sensitive military operations, recording them with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else in her carefully ordered life. The pattern might have gone unnoticed indefinitely, if not for a routine security review triggered by her application for a classified assignment. The background investigators cross-referenced her flight logs with known operational data, expecting to find the usual discrepancies that plagued military record-keeping. Instead, they discovered correlations so precise they could only be explained by direct participation in operations that didn't officially exist. Now, 3 weeks after that discovery, Ghost stood before the men whose missions she'd unknowingly documented. The SEALs who had initially dismissed her as another desk-flying transport pilot were beginning to understand they'd underestimated not just her capabilities, but her significance to operations they thought had been completely compartmentalized. Commander Kellerman looked up from the flight log, his expression transforming from suspicion to something approaching awe. "Captain Nakamura," he said slowly, "we need to talk about what you've seen." The subsequent debriefing lasted 14 hours. Ghost sat at the same conference table where her flight log had been dissected, answering questions with the same precision she applied to pre-flight checklists. Yes, she remembered the unauthorized landing strip in Sector 77 Alpha. Yes, she'd noticed the tactical teams that didn't match standard Army deployment patterns. No, she hadn't reported the discrepancies because she'd assumed they were part of compartmentalized operations above her security clearance. The SEALs listened with growing amazement as Ghost reconstructed missions from memory. She recalled weather conditions, terrain features, and tactical indicators with encyclopedic detail. More importantly, she'd observed patterns that the operators themselves had missed. Her unique vantage point, simultaneously inside and outside the operational loop, had given her insights into the larger strategic picture that even mission commanders lacked. "You were there," Razor finally said, his voice heavy with realization. "Every insertion, every extraction, every supply drop, you were there." Ghost nodded. "I was just doing my job." "No," said Master Chief Petty Officer Jonas Hammer Kowalski, speaking for the first time since the briefing began. His massive frame dwarfed the regulation chair, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that came from surviving 30 years of special operations. "You were doing our job. You were keeping us alive, and you didn't even know it." The silence that followed was different from the skeptical quiet that had greeted her hours earlier. This was the reverent silence of warriors recognizing another warrior, even if she wore different wings and flew different missions. The men in that room had spent careers building reputations through confirmed kills and successful extractions. Ghost had built something else entirely, a legacy of invisible competence that had made their legendary missions possible. Over the following days, the full scope of Ghost's inadvertent involvement became clear. She hadn't just provided logistical support. She'd been the critical link in a chain of operations spanning 4 years and 3 continents. Her routine flights had delivered specialized equipment, extracted wounded operators, and provided emergency refueling for aircraft that couldn't appear on standard flight schedules. The investigation revealed a shadow network of support operations so compartmentalized that even the Pentagon planners hadn't fully grasped its scope. Ghost's flight log was the Rosetta Stone that allowed intelligence analysts to decode the full picture of America's most sensitive special operations campaign, a campaign that had been more successful than anyone realized, largely because of a quiet pilot who kept meticulous records and never asked unnecessary questions. As word of the discovery spread through the special operations community, Ghost's reputation underwent a transformation as dramatic as her call sign's evolution from mockery to monument. The pilots who had once dismissed her as overly cautious began to understand that her precision had been protecting classified operations. The ground crews who had wondered about her unusual flight patterns realized they'd been maintaining aircraft involved in missions that would reshape global counterterrorism strategy. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred in Ghost herself. For the first time in her career, she found herself invited into the inner circle of mission planning. Her encyclopedic knowledge of flight routes, weather patterns, and tactical considerations made her invaluable to operations that required the kind of invisible perfection she'd spent 8 years mastering. The request came from the Pentagon itself. Would Captain Nakamura consider a transfer to a Special Operations Aviation Unit? The assignment would remain classified, the missions would be dangerous, and the recognition would be limited to the small community of operators who understood what it meant to fly in the shadows between official acknowledgement and operational necessity. Ghost accepted without hesitation, not because she craved recognition or adventure, but because she finally understood what she'd been training for during all those years of routine flights and meticulous record-keeping. She hadn't been invisible by accident. She'd been preparing to become the kind of pilot who could carry the most important missions without leaving fingerprints in official histories. Her final briefing at Oceana was different from the first. The same conference room, the same fluorescent lighting, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The SEALs who had once laughed at her flight log now stood when she entered. They understood that Ghost hadn't just documented their operations. She'd enabled them, protected them, and in many cases, saved them without any of them realizing how close they'd come to mission failure. Commander Kellerman presented her with a commendation that would never appear in her official service record. The citation read simply, "For extraordinary achievement in providing critical operational support during extended special operations activities." Captain Nakamura's precise execution of complex aviation missions enabled the successful completion of objectives vital to national security. It was understated, like everything else about Ghost's career, but the men in that room understood its true significance. As she prepared for her transfer to Joint Special Operations Command, Ghost packed her personal effects with the same methodical care she applied to pre-flight inspections. Her apartment had always been spartanly furnished, a reflection of a career spent preparing for the next assignment rather than putting down roots. But among her few possessions, the detailed flight logs occupied a place of honor. Those logs, now classified at levels that required special security clearances just to acknowledge their existence, represented more than just meticulous record-keeping. They were the documentary evidence of a shadow war that had been won through invisible excellence rather than public heroics. Ghost had become both historian and participant in operations that would influence global security for generations, all while maintaining the quiet professionalism that had defined her career from its very beginning. The night before her departure, she stood on the flight line at Oceana and watched the sunset paint the Virginia sky in shades of amber and rose. In a few hours, she would begin a new phase of her career, one that would finally match her capabilities with missions worthy of her unique talents. But for now, she simply stood in the familiar embrace of aircraft and tarmac, surrounded by the sounds and smells that had defined her adult life. A young lieutenant approached, his fresh flight suit crisp with new insignia. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Captain Nakamura, the Ghost?" She turned to face him, nodding the mixture of curiosity and respect in his expression. Word traveled fast in the aviation community, and her story had already begun to take on the mythic qualities that transformed military careers into legends. "I'm Indira Nakamura," she replied, extending her hand, "but everyone calls me Ghost." The lieutenant shook her hand with the reverence reserved for meeting heroes. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm starting transport training next month, and my instructor said I should study your flight techniques. He said you're the best pilot he's ever seen." Ghost smiled, remembering her own early days when praise from instructors had seemed like the most important thing in the world. Now, she understood that true excellence wasn't measured by commendations or recognition, but by the quiet accumulation of moments when precision and competence made the difference between success and failure, between life and death. "Focus on the details," she told the lieutenant. "Master the fundamentals, and remember, sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody talks about." As the young pilot walked away, Ghost returned her attention to the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to serve in the shadows between official acknowledgement and operational necessity. But tonight, for the last time in her career, she was simply Captain Indira Nakamura, transport pilot, standing alone on a tarmac and watching aircraft trace silver lines across the infinite canvas of evening sky. The SEALs had laughed at her flight log because they couldn't understand what they were seeing. Now they knew better. Ghost's records hadn't just documented secret operations. They'd revealed the invisible architecture that made modern special operations possible. She was no longer the quiet pilot who flew routine missions and kept meticulous records. She was Ghost Nakamura, the aviator whose precision had kept America's most elite warriors alive during their most dangerous missions. And in the morning, she would disappear again into the classified world where her talents had always belonged, carrying new missions toward horizons that existed only in the space between official acknowledgement and operational necessity. The sky above Oceana held no answers about what awaited her, but Ghost had never needed certainty to find her way. She had her instruments, her training, and the quiet confidence that came from mastering the art of invisible excellence. The transformation was complete. The woman who had once been dismissed as overly cautious was now recognized as the pilot whose caution had prevented disasters that never made headlines because they never happened. Ghost had found her place in the machinery of modern warfare, not as a celebrated hero, but as something more valuable, a professional whose competence made heroes possible. In the years that would follow, young pilots would study her techniques and wonder about the classified missions that had made her legendary within the special operations community. They would learn about precision flying and meticulous record-keeping, about the importance of maintaining focus during routine missions that might prove to be anything but routine. But they would never fully understand the unique combination of circumstances that had transformed a quiet transport pilot into one of the most important aviators in modern military history. That understanding belonged only to Ghost herself and to the men who had learned to trust their lives to her invisible wings. Together, they had written a chapter in military history that would never be declassified, never be celebrated in public ceremonies, and never be forgotten by those who knew its true significance. It was the perfect legacy for a pilot who had spent her career mastering the art of being everywhere and nowhere, essential and invisible, legendary and unknown. The last light faded from the Virginia sky, and Captain Indira Ghost Nakamura walked toward the terminal building that would, in the morning, launch her toward a new chapter of service in the shadows. Behind her, the flight line settled into the quiet rhythms of night operations, while ahead waited missions that would test everything she had learned about flying in the space between the possible and the impossible. She had become Ghost not through accident or assignment, but through the accumulated weight of thousands of flight hours spent perfecting the art of invisible excellence. Tomorrow would bring new skis, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that sometimes the most important warriors are those who fight their battles in silence, winning victories that can never be acknowledged, protecting secrets that can never be shared. The briefing room at Oceana fell dark as Ghost disappeared into the classified world where legends were born not through public recognition, but through the quiet accumulation of moments when exceptional skill made the impossible seem routine. She carried with her the respect of warriors who had learned to measure courage not in moments of public heroism, but in years of private dedication to excellence that made heroes possible. The SEALs had stopped laughing. They understood now that Ghost's flight log wasn't just a record of missions. It was a testament to the kind of professional excellence that formed the invisible foundation of every successful operation. They had witnessed the transformation of a pilot from overlooked to essential, from invisible to legendary, from ghost to icon. And in the morning, she would take to the skis once more, carrying new missions toward horizons that existed only in the classified space, where America's most important battles were fought by warriors whose names would never appear in history books, whose achievements would never be celebrated in public ceremonies, but whose dedication to invisible excellence would continue to protect the nation they served with quiet pride and relentless competence.